Hi everyone, welcome. Down here in my wormery, the newest stuff is over here on the right. So the newest of my bins right here. The 4-week-old system, which was fed 8 days ago, is sitting here with a pretty good sized divot where we had last fed. The worms have definitely created a void where the last feeding was placed. And after 8 days you might think, why not feed them some more? But I don't really plan on feeding them, but I do want to do something to this bin, which is try to round up the last of the worms that did not come over when we launched this system 4 weeks ago. There were a whole bunch of stragglers remaining in the material that we pulled those worms out of, and the material has been placed into this bag system here. It's a vermibag tote. The main reason for wanting the material in the bag was with the assumption that by being in the bag it might air out and dry to the point where the worms will possibly move out of the material. And after 4 weeks of being in the bag here, I'd really like to think that the worms have made their way out of the material. I mean, it is true that 8 days ago when we fed the system over there, we did peek in here, and we did actually reorient the location of these bait boxes that had originally been out on the edge of the bin over on one side, over into the middle. And then I even came in here 2 days ago with some pieces of watermelon rind, in the hopes that I might sweeten the deal enough to possibly get the worms to really make their way over and finally come into the location where I can round them up and haul them out. My hope is that at this point, with this material being 420 days old now, 60 weeks, 60 weeks, and actually 84 days now since we started trying to migrate the worms out of these systems, it's really time that this batch of castings was such that we could just harvest it, get the worms, the last of the worms out of there, and call it a day. So that's my main reason for being down here. I want to extract these boxes, possibly round up any worms that are just in the vicinity and not quite in the boxes yet, because I'd really like to see that this material is harvestable and that this bag can just be removed from the shelf and make some room for other stuff. So I'm going to put a glove on. We're going to see about bringing this thing to an end today, hopefully. Keeping my fingers crossed. Let's get to work. So here we have one of my handy plastic containers that I use for this sort of extraction project. And at this point, everything other than castings comes out. And we'll explore what's in the bait boxes momentarily. For now, I'd simply like to extract them. And before any straggler worms really have a chance to scurry away, I'd like to just rummage through this material quickly just to get a reality check on what's going on here, because to tell you the truth, I don't know what to expect. But I really would like to think that we've gotten the last of the worms out of here, and clearly we have not. So it does seem like we're going through a little bit of a manual roundup. It's amazing to me that these worms are still hanging out in this material, despite the fact that it's quite dry at this point. I've created this nice oasis for them, even over here on the edges. Jeez Louise. I really had no intention of doing this. I really did have high hopes for the migration being complete by now, with the worms all rounded up in the bait boxes. But as you can see, there's a good number of worms still hanging out in the material. Look at them all. Can't believe it. So I'm going to do my best just to gather up as many of them as I could, and as for the remainder of whatever's left in here, I'm not sure what to do with it. I just can't imagine continuing here with further baiting of the material to get more stragglers out. It just seems ridiculous. Perhaps if we are diligent and as thorough as we possibly can be to get as many worms as we can, we'll get a pretty high degree of confidence that we've got almost all of them. But for some reason I'm just not getting that, you know. Almost every handful seems to have a good number of worms still hanging out in the stuff, remarkably. Although I would imagine that once we do this kind of stirring up of the fairly dry material that's been sitting out here on the surface for I don't know how long now, quite a long time, combining it with whatever little bits of moisture that are down low, this stuff is probably going to become quite inhospitable from a worm's point of view. So maybe I just gotta reset bait again. I don't know, I'm just so not into that. I don't know why. I gotta tell you, this material remarkably dry, and for that reason very surprising to see so many worms still hanging out in this stuff. I mean, besides putting the watermelon into those bait boxes 2 days ago, I was coming in here once in a while and spraying the contents of these boxes with my spray bottle just to make sure that the moisture level in them was high, so that any worms cruising in the area would sense the moisture, hopefully, and head over. And then once they would end up in the bait box, that hopefully they would stay. I'm almost wondering if the best bet at this point is just to simply use this stuff, go straight out into the garden with this stuff tomorrow, give it to some of my peppers and tomatoes and my cucumbers, and then whatever worms go along for the ride, they get to roam free out in the great outdoors. Unfortunately, they'd be separated from their tribe in the process, but I guess on the flip side they would have the benefit of being free. I don't know what to do. Definitely tempting to do something like that just for the ability to call it a day and consider this as done and not have to institute yet another process in the interest of trying to round up just a few more worms left behind in this stuff. And I gotta tell you, it's amazing to me that so many worms are still in this stuff. So weird. I'm just once in a while bumping into a little piece of material that looks like it's not a compostable type of a material, and I'm just pulling it out. In a number of my bins for a while there, I kept spotting little fragments of blue material that must have gotten into my shredder. Stuff that clearly wasn't breaking down over great amounts of time. So I got in the habit of pulling out anything that was blue. And I just thought I found a few pieces of that, which I pulled out a moment ago. I mean, it might not be 100%, but it's pretty darn thorough if you ask me, as far as the worms on this side of the bin. I think we've managed to extract the better part of them, hopefully. You know what? I'm not going to hold that over my head or let it bother me. I think I am just going to put this stuff in the garden tomorrow. And any worms remaining in it are going to be free. And that's going to be the happy ending, I guess, for these little guys. So I suppose there's this side of the bin too that we've not even looked at in terms of excuse me, in terms of seeing how many stragglers we've got to try to round up. So let's just do a quick examination of the stuff over on this side. I mean, look, there's like clear pockets of material that is holding lots and lots of worms in it still. Some sort of a little moist pocket of stuff. Unbelievable. I mean, I've tilled this material, I've tried breaking it up. I don't understand how little pockets of moisture like that can still remain. Not even so little, tell you the truth. Quite large pockets of moisture with quite a large number of worms hanging out around it. I hope there's not many more like that. That was just maybe, hopefully, a fluke, and we luckily stumbled on it pretty quick and hopefully managed to get the majority of the worms while they were still all kind of huddled together there. I mean, worms will tend to huddle together when they start feeling distress, perhaps in an environment that is starting to become inhospitably dry. So maybe they weren't really even huddled around some sort of a nice juicy morsel. Maybe they were really just trying to keep each other safe and hydrated by huddling together. But, you know, at this point, whatever worms I'm able to round up here in this kind of lame method of pulling them out individually, I'm just going to treat that as the end. You know, this system's going to come to an end today, no matter what. The last of the worms are going to get reunited with the worms that got hauled out 4 weeks ago to launch that new system. And then I'll come back in a few more days and we'll feed that system. But after 8 days, I'm guessing there might still be leftovers in that box. There is a pretty good sized divot over there. I mean, what we saw earlier was clear evidence of worms definitely ravishing what I had put in there last time, but what I put in there last time was a fairly substantial amount of food. It is true also that we did put a good number of worms over into the system when we launched it 4 weeks ago. I didn't come down with any of the estimates that we established together with our guesses based on the feedback I got in the comments. But I will be looking for everyone's feedback today to get an understanding of what people think in terms of how many worms we are launching off into the system so that I can update the estimate for that system's worm population estimate. And it's always fun to have those estimates which are kind of jointly crowdsourced from everyone's input, because it does feel to me like by doing it that way we are probably coming up with numbers that are probably pretty close to the actual population of the system. It's so funny, I really did not expect to find so many worms on this side. For some reason I felt like all the worms we were seeing on the other side was some sort of a kind of a weird aberration, and that on this side we just find nothing, but it almost seems like on this side we found even more in that huge jumble. And I tell you, my arm is getting a little bit tired from all this picking up and putting over of worms. Not because the worms are so heavy, but because I'm just a weakling. But geez, we've been going at this for a while now. I think it's time to give ourselves some sort of a cutoff point. Perhaps just a couple more searches, a couple more turnovers of the material to see who else we can round up, and then consider whoever's left behind as the lucky few that's going to make it out into the garden, out into nature, and be free. Although some people might argue that being here in the wormery is actually a much better life for a worm versus being out in the garden or out in nature where they're subject to predators and bad weather and other stuff. Yeah, it is true that worms definitely get spoiled by being in your wormery. They get all kinds of delicious foods, they have all their needs taken care of, and it does seem like if we keep rummaging here, we're going to just continue finding worms. It'll just be an endless search, which I do not feel like continuing on at this point. So I think it's time to finish what we're doing here, because we could probably still find another dozen worms or so if we kept looking. But then what about those few worms in here that really were excited about the prospect of being released out in the great outdoors? We'd be robbing them of that awesome experience and that exciting next phase of their lives. So why don't we leave it at that? All right. The little fan I have blowing on me from overhead is making a lot of racket too. I might have to turn that off for the remainder of the video. All right, let's see what's going on in here, and then we can proceed to releasing them in their new home. Well, it's the moment of truth. Their new home is right beneath here, and I guess what I'm most interested in doing is simply dropping the contents of these bins or these little boxes out, if they'll release. I almost feel like I'm going to need some sort of a tool to make this happen, or maybe I just need both hands. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. We've got ourselves a pretty good turnout. I mean, we did definitely recognize the fact that there was a good number of worms still hanging out in the castings when we extracted the first batch of worms 4 weeks ago. Was the reason we decided it would be necessary to bait worms out of here to get the remainder of the worms out. So I think there might still be a worm in there. I'll see about fishing them out momentarily, but I'd really like to see what's going on in here too. So here's some of the yummy food that's coming along for the ride with these little guys. So in a way, it's almost like a lightweight feeding that this bin is getting today. I'm not going to register it as a feeding, but oops, let's not forget, we are going to try to estimate how many worms we've got here, so let's not let any sneak out of view. So I just thought I would try to move around the contents of bait box number 1 and try to unfold some of this cardboard, just so you could see how they're all sort of nestled into little nooks and crannies and hanging out in little bundles and huddling together. So I'm already starting to formulate a little bit of an estimate of how many worms we just pulled out of bait box number 1. Let's unload the contents of bait box number 2. Whoa. Let's get these 5 worms back into the mix here with all their little friends and neighbors. Once again, pretty good sized turnout in this bait box too, perhaps even more than we found in bait box number 1. Definitely a nice turnout in this one. Yeah, I think I'm starting to come up with a little number in my head, and it's not bad. Perhaps even more than I expected. I definitely knew that there was a good number of worms still hanging out in that castings. There's even more in here. Even more in here. So I definitely knew we still had quite a ways to go before that batch of castings was to be completely evacuated and depopulated. I just never thought that it would take so long. I mean, even there was another system that we started the migration of the worms out of on the same day that we started this system's migration, and that migration actually ended a couple weeks ago after 70 days, which also seemed to me like an incredibly long period of time. And even here, 84 days after we started trying to migrate the worms out, still seems like we didn't quite get them all. So I definitely saw a straggler worm in here. I got him. And I also saw one straggler worm in here. And I didn't get him on that try. I thought I'd get him. Felt like I got him. Oh, there he is. Come on, buddy. Everyone's waiting for you. Alright, I think that makes it official. I believe we've now got the final extraction of the worms out of the 420-day-old system, which is now finally coming to an end. Thank goodness, after all that time. 420 days. Crazy. 60 weeks. 6-0. 8 weeks more than a year. So, all that remains is to cut these little guys loose in their new home, reuniting them with their friends and neighbors that they used to live with in the old system. So I'm just going to get this plastic covering out of our way. I guess we've got a couple other coverings to get out of the way. These are just things that were positioned on top of the feeding zone. And I'm not even interested in seeing how their feeding is coming along. It does look like they've done a number on what they were fed last time, and they probably are due for another feeding soon. That's not what we're here for. We're here to release more worms into the system. And as usual, I'd really love to hear everyone's thoughts in the comments about just how many worms we're releasing here today. So please, let me know. Drop a quick comment. And as I always do, I'll be including that number into the worm population estimate for the system. We always average everyone's numbers together to come up with the final estimate. This way it's sort of a crowdsourced bit of information, which does tend to be pretty accurate as far as statistical practices generally go. So before these little guys all squirm out of view, I'm going to make an attempt to spread them out a little bit, just so it's really easy for all of them to gain direct access down to their new home, into the bed. And then that'll be the end of the show. Let's leave them be. Well, I believe that all the worms that had direct access to material into which they can burrow down were pretty quickly out of view, but we're still left with some worms sort of stranded out on top of some of these pieces of material where they were unable to get direct access to the bedding below. So I'm going to just flip those pieces of material over on which we did have little pockets of worms stranded, like here too, just between the folds of this piece of cardboard, all these worms tucked away and hiding. So you never know where there's worms going to be kind of hidden between a couple sheets of paper. And that's part of the reason I think sometimes these estimates are a little bit tricky, because the worms are pretty evasive, elusive, whatever the right word is. They do somehow manage to hide out of view despite your best effort to reveal them and to view them in order to come up with an estimate of what you're talking about here. But you have to leave a little bit of it to, I guess, just your imagination, and factor in those worms that you're not even visually seeing and assume that they're there, just the way I just revealed a few little hiding spots that they were tucked away into, in order to establish your estimates. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what everyone thinks in terms of how many worms we just released into this 28-day-old system. And that was haul out number 2. And the final haul out of the 420-day-old, 60-day-old system finally at an end after 12 weeks of trying to migrate the worms out. That's what you get when you start out with material that's way too wet. So we'll be back into this bin soon, one of these days soon, just to make sure we give them a feeding. It'll be due for a feeding soon, I'm sure, but not today. Today was all about releasing worms. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. Don't forget to comment too. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.